Elder Scrolls Blades is a first-person dungeon crawler originally announced to be launching on all platforms, but in reality it only landed on cell phones. It was later released on the Nintendo Switch, but let's rewind a bit. Elder Scrolls Blades has changed a lot, enough to merit a third video now. In my previous video, I mentioned that Elder Scrolls Blades was poorly monetized and could be maintained entirely off of cosmetics if it was done right. Well, now, Elder Scrolls Blades doesn't have the loot chest problem that I talked about in my previous video. But I suspect the cosmetics are not bringing in the kind of money my video suggested it may have. There's a simple reason for that, and we'll touch on it later. We'll be talking about not only how Elder Scrolls Blades has improved, but in theory, how it could further improve. But before we can get into the good, we have to look into the past, and the past wasn't so good. I mentioned I reviewed this game twice, talking about how it was a pretty low quality game on 3 separate merits: dungeon crawler, Elder Scrolls game, and free to play. Talked about how a small change made it go from virtually unplayable at a decent pace to a fine game to play. And when I say fine, of course the game still contained huge issues, and I went over some of them. Now, I'm not saying the developers watched that video, but at least a couple suggestions from that video are now in the game, at the very least. Widespread feedback from the community has been listened to. At the time of making that video, I said the game was perfectly mediocre, but still not an Elder Scrolls game. So here we are, once again, looking at Elder Scrolls Blades. To put it bluntly, the core gameplay loop is the same. The way the game plays is the same. So those looking for an open-world exploration-based action game with light RPG elements, aka the Elder Scrolls series, you won't find that in Elder Scrolls Blades. The game does have NPC conversations. It has a main story. It has some side quests. But all of those things are done on the most surface level. The core gameplay loop of Elder Scrolls Blades being go into a dungeon, rescue some people, or kill a boss, or loot some targets, rinse and repeat. The story missions will sometimes throw you for a loop with some mid-mission dialogue, but none of it is well written, and is more or less a formality to make things more interesting. Or at least seem more interesting than they really are. So obviously, you're not coming here for the story, you're coming here for a dungeon crawling experience. And if you're willing to buy into that and have fun on those terms, this game is far better than it was before. In my first and second videos, the largest complaints were, of course, the monetization. With the exception of an occasional quest reward, almost all the gear in Elder Scrolls Blades came from loot chests. The loot chests were found in dungeons and obtained as rewards for finishing dungeons, quests, and what are known as jobs. In the first incarnation of the game, loot chests took 5 seconds for wood, 3 hours for silver, 6 hours for gold, 12 hours for elder, and 24 hours for legendary chest types, respectively. And you could only open one chest at a time. Combined with a limited chest inventory system, this meant that you were quickly running up against a paywall that said, "Your chest inventory is full." And there was no reason to play the game at that point. So you came back hours later after opening chests and played again, only to refill your chest inventory and repeat. It was miserable. However, the first major update to Blades saw the silver chest, or tier 2 timers, reduced from 3 hours to 1 hour each. Leaving everything else about the chest system alone, this alone extended playtime on a fresh account from 5 to 10 hours, as it originally was, up over 40 hours before running into the chest inventory is full paywall, provided you invested your free gems immediately into chest inventory expansions. The problem was still there, but it was far, far off, and considering your average AAA game these days nets you 30 to 60 hours of gameplay, that was pretty good for a free-to-play game. Well, now, in present day, the game has received several major updates, and now the chest timer system that used to exist is gone. You can open any chest, regardless of quality, instantly for free. You still find them, you still earn them, and you can, if you want, opt to open them instantly or go into the options and save them for later in an infinite chest inventory. But now you don't have to worry about that limited chest inventory, meaning you can play the game as much as you want without losing out on loot. Now, they still sell the loot boxes in the store, and those open instantly just like the ones in the dungeon now. And I don't think this monetization, them selling loot boxes, would even be necessary at all if they optimize their game properly to sell cosmetics. I'll save some suggestions on that a little way down the road. But the point is, aside from small grinding sessions between levels 35 and 40, I never once felt the need for better gear that I had to have right here, right now. I never felt the need to buy a chest, aside from that end game phase for the main quest from 35 to 40. The game has a decent progression balance as long as you are looking for and finding secret areas, bonus chests, and levels. You will not be hurting for loot. The lower level chests that are common shower you with crafting materials, allowing you to constantly create better weapons if the game is being stingy about providing you of a weapon type of your choice. In addition to loot chests being better, breakable objects in dungeon also contain more loot on average, making scouring the environment for them far more worthwhile. It still isn't that open world exploration but at least in terms of a dungeon crawler, it makes breaking open every pot and crate feel more worthwhile. Finally, almost every non-story dungeon has a boss enemy in it now, which functionally is the same type of enemy in the rest of the dungeon, but it has higher stats and a unique name. Killing them will cause an explosion of loot, usually containing one weapon, armor, or jewelry piece, meaning by doing randomly generated dungeons, it is entirely possible outside of loot chests to obtain high quality or even end-game gear. I'd actually argue loot is somewhat oversaturated now, and I'll address that later on as well. Suffice it to say, loot in Elder Scrolls Blades has undergone an overhaul, and almost everything you do feels more rewarding. They tore down the paywall, and now you can play as much as you want, as long as you want. Now, one thing Elder Scrolls Blades has never been lacking in since the very beginning was the combat. Despite being locked into a single position, combat is more complex than any other game in the Elder Scrolls series. Timing matters. Blocking matters. Spell and skill timers matter. Weapon type matters. Enchantments matter. This has been true since the game initially launched. But before, the game only provided you with subtle animation cues as to what the NPCs were doing. You could still play the game very well. However, now the game properly telegraphs what abilities the enemy is using so you can react strategically instead of making educated guesses. This change is massive and makes the game easier and also at the same time less obtuse. Because in the past, there was no real way of knowing whether the overhead smash ability was the same as a power attack. You just had to guess. Now, because weapon types and enchantments have always mattered, the game has always incentivized the switching of weapons for different enemy types, while simultaneously making this a royal pain to do so. Thankfully, in one of those major updates I was talking about, there is now a weapon and skill loadout system, where you are able to set up a series of loadouts based on your equipment, skills, and spells, and switch between them on the fly, in the field, or even in combat. The only place that restricts the switching is PvP. I won my first match of PvP and decided it wasn't very important to me, and I kind of quit from there. This is consistent with how I treat most free-to-play games that contain PvP, such as Path of Exile or Warframe. So again, we won't be talking about PvP too much, other than some ideas that might help it out. The point of all this is that the loadout system is a huge quality of life boon that the game really needed. So since my previous video, the loot's better, the combat's better, the gear swapping is better, and the randomly generated dungeons are still mostly plain and samey, unfortunately. They really need more diversity. By that, I mean different versions of the same rooms. You know, this one might not have a dragon skeleton, that one might. By changing up very simple things, it'll keep the player guessing as to whether they are going through the exact same module for the 15,000th time. Spoilers, you are, but they could disguise it a little bit better. Suffice it to say, even though the dungeons are still plain and samey, they at least contain more rewarding loot and randomly generated bosses. As for reasons to log in, the developers somewhat shot themselves in the foot by outright removing the chest system without replacing it with any other hooks to pull players in. With mobile games, players need a reason to log in every day, other than just the game is fun. Obviously, you don't want to tie that to a paywall, preventing you from playing the game meaningfully, otherwise players will get put off of the game. But having no hook at all to get players back every day means players will forget about the game, and another game that does have a proper hook will take its place. People like myself who love single player games or games with a heavy story emphasis want a standard story from beginning to end, and then we quit the game and we move on to another game. That's typically how we operate. So it may sound somewhat alien when I'm talking about hooks and things like that. So let's talk about some things that I know that maybe not everyone knows regarding free-to-play games. This is very simple stuff, and anyone who has looked at monetization in free-to-play games should know this, but maybe it hasn't been phrased in such a simple way before. So there are two methods of successful free-to-play monetization. First, there are those built around the daily login hook. And then those built around development milestones as long-term hooks. The most wildly popular trend toward the former, while the most highly regarded as either being of quality or consumer-friendly trend toward the latter. However, the most profitable games, regardless of quality or popularity, they do both. Those are the ones that garner community loyalty. The old chess timer system was effective at bringing people back between 1 and 12-hour intervals, depending on chess size. But it also turned itself into a paywall that nobody liked and was the center of most people's negative judgments about the game. Besides, of course, the inherent stigma in the gaming space that comes from a game being on cell phones to begin with. That's the major hurdle that a lot of people coming from other Elder Scrolls games have to overcome. But remember, they got rid of the chess system. So after some time of having no hook, they released the events system. Every so often, an event occurs, at which point a portal near your town opens, and creatures on the other side of the portal are affected by a strange nature of that pocket realm. That's lore speak for there's a gimmick to that dungeon. The enemies can only be killed in a certain way, or the monsters will have a certain tactic that they really rely on, and you need to set your gear, skills, and strategy to deal with that gimmick. The event has stages, and each stage increases in rewards and difficulty until you've completed the entire event and receive a payout reward. Every stage of the event contains a currency called sigils. Unlike the game's premium currency known as gems that can occasionally be found in chests or on bosses or from quests or challenges, but also could be bought with real-life money, those are gems, sigils cannot be purchased or obtained outside of the events. You do the events to obtain the sigils. As far as we know, there's no other way to get it. I hope it doesn't, but that might change. The Sigil store has in-game items from clusters of crafting materials at the low end to straight-up enchanted Daedric gear with a bonus enchantment on the higher end. So players are encouraged to return to every event and play through all of the stages to get as many sigils as possible. If they are low skill players, they can do just fine on the first or second stages and then call it quits. And if they're a dedicated player, they can take the event all the way and get more out of the event. This is the game's current hook. And for a player who's mostly leveled up but wants an armor or weapon with a bonus enchantment, this isn't something your average Elder Scrolls player can appreciate, really. The game will never be that open world exploration experience that people come to for the Elder Scrolls. I do think there are a few things that can be done within the framework of a mobile dungeon crawler that we'll talk about later. Now, onto the story front. Elder Scrolls Blades is fairly simple. The game takes place between Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion and Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Further towards Skyrim, right when the White Gold Concordat was signed, you are a former member of the Blades, the Imperial Spy Masters and Bodyguards, returning to your homeland of Cyrodiil for the first time in years. Your hometown was destroyed. As far as you can tell, mercenaries working for the Bloodfall Queen, a ruler of a minor corner of Cyrodiil, caused it. As the story progresses, it becomes apparent that an ancient Ayleid Lich King was released from his tomb and was the real cause of the town's destruction. Side quests involve you helping random people, assisting other secret members of the Blades in hunting down dragons and other tasks, and occasionally fending off Thalmor and other minor threats on behalf of townsfolk who come to you with their problems. One of the more interesting side quests actually involve the Bloodfall Queen and her family. Once the quests are done, though, all you'll have left to do are jobs, events, and the Abyss. Jobs are randomly generated chunks of dungeons. Occasionally, the game developers will add a new quest to do, which are more or less mechanically go to a dungeon, clear out the enemies, grab some objects, sometimes talk to an NPC, sometimes fight a boss, and then the quest completes and you're taken back to town. If that sounds exactly what you do in jobs, that's because that is exactly what you do in jobs. The only difference is that a little bit of story plays out while you do it. The writing is quite frankly worse than Skyrim, if that's even possible. But even with the lackluster mini-stories, they still give the player enough justification for doing what they're doing, as opposed to jobs that just sort of teleport you out to a random dungeon. The NPC conversations leading up to the quest make all the difference between actual quests and jobs. Quests also often have a very specific reward in addition to the randomly generated loot that falls off bosses or from chests. I know I talk about how Elder Scrolls Blades is low quality or generic or just bland in the writing department. However, when weighted against jobs, which have practically no justification for doing anything, Elder Scrolls Blades quests are good, and the game needs more of them. Not only in the base game, but in every major update the game has, it needs more quests. Remember when I talked about how the most profitable and successful free-to-play games operate under large-scale updates along with meaningful daily rewards? That's what Elder Scrolls Blades needs. It needs storyline expansions. Even if functionally players are doing the exact same thing, going to point A to point B, kill the boss, talk to an NPC in the quest. I imagine the developers have gotten quite good at making these from a mechanical perspective. So assuming they could make 15 to 20 of these in a short amount of time, all they need is a decent writer to submit them some small bits of dialogue. Every 3 to 4 months, you could release a storyline expansion that builds on the previous one, whilst all you're actually doing is delving a dungeon. If you want to get real special, maybe add a single new monster as the boss of that particular storyline expansion, and then you could add those into the pool of dungeon bosses for jobs after they are added. Maybe wait one expansion cycle and then dump it into the normal enemy pool. Or better yet, have it so it's dynamic and you don't encounter that particular monster type until you have beaten that particular quest that introduces them. But in terms of easy to grab storylines that already exist in Elder Scrolls Blades, there are so many things you can expand upon. The dragons in Cyrodiil, the newly uncovered Ayleid ruins, the Bloodfall Queen's court. And we'll get back to that one. The legacy of her family and the River Snake. There's tons of threads you could pull on and make an entire 15 to 20 quest expansion pack, which is, from a functional gameplay perspective, exactly the same as the rest of the game, but with NPCs, events, and rewards unique to that storyline expansion. From a development standpoint, practically no effort. But it would require someone actually sitting down and writing the dialogue and coming up with these things. Let's be honest here, this game is a live service, so the idea is to create 2 main story threads and stagger them between 3 to 4 month cycles. So in other words, every 3 to 4 months, storyline A. Then 3 to 4 months later, storyline B. Then 3 to 4 months later, continue storyline A. And repeat over and over and over. So, in one expansion, you'd deal with the Bloodfall Queen's legacy. In the next one, you'd deal with the dragons of Cyrodiil. And then in the next one, you'd go back to her legacy, perhaps dealing with another county of Cyrodiil, and so on. If the player buys into the core gameplay loop of do stuff in town, go to dungeon, beat boss, come back to town, the world can be as big as you want it to be, with as much content as you can add in future updates. And I honestly think that would be the key to getting major influxes of players, and by that I mean returning players, is by having marked expansion points. Regular events to keep players from being bored, yes, but every game has player fall off. And it's always up to new content expansions to bring players back. Earlier, I said the game was oversaturated with loot. What I mean by that is you can get Iron, Elven, Quicksilver, so on drops while opening end-game level chests, which sounds incredibly silly as they are lower tiered with less armor points on them. So first and foremost, players need a reason to get and collect this lower tiered gear. And while this exists with certain gear types like glass and Stalrim, materials like silver, dwarven, quicksilver are looted far too often, and therefore should have a niche that they are good at. Next, for lower tiered gear, players need an additional forging system for when an item has reached its max forging to bring it on par with the higher tiered gear. This should ideally require higher end materials from that higher end gear, ensuring that every set has something it's good at and the ability to reinforce those armors. Say we have some silver that we reinforce with ebony or daedric to bring it up to ebony or daedric standards. The purpose of this would be twofold. First, to give some value to these lower end drops that players are getting, so it doesn't feel like you just got trash. Secondly, while players are encouraged to hold on to extra sets of gear, they will be encouraged to buy inventory expansions with the gems they get. Monetization, of course. That's how Path of Exile deals with it. They sell stash tabs. So imagine your silver armor had a defense bonus against undead, and it wasn't just a minor one. It turns out the higher you forge this thing, the stronger that anti-undead bonus gets. And it was Dragonbone reinforced. So when a player gets a silver item, they'll happily scrap it, knowing that getting those silver ingots gets them closer to forging an end-game silver armor with it later on. I'm just picking a random idea, but better defense against undead is pretty good. Next, let's discuss upward scaling. Players are eventually going to hit their power cap and quit. The way to delay this is to add incremental scaling, where players can continue to make these huge advancements until they hit their current gear cap. Then, using event sigils or some other rare resource, periodically increase their gear by fractional amounts. So there's never such a thing as a truly maxed out gear item. It's just the rate at which you can improve it drastically reduces in order to avoid making it a problem for scaling, except to players who work on the same item every day for years. In this vein, players should be able to rename their gear items. Functionally, it would be nicknaming it. But imagine a player who has crafted their favorite sword, spends weeks or months investing event sigils into it to make it a few percentage points better than any other sword in the game. They are already attached to this item. Respect them by letting them name it. Maybe they spend a few gems to name it. They get free gems from chests, so that's a good way to flush them out of the system. Now, delaying player drop-off does not eliminate it. In fact, with systems like this, because players tend to stay dedicated for longer, it can be harder to regain dedicated players who have left due to burnout. That's why regular expansions are so necessary as a force to get players back who had have previously quit. Players will come back for more stories if the stories are good. Now, it would be possible to do this entirely well with written dialogue, retreading the same locations over and over. But if you really want to get players excited about your material, then you got to invest in the game. Create new dungeon tiles based off some iconic locations in the Elder Scrolls games. And create a narrative that has players going back to one of them every couple months, every 3 or 4 months even, as a part of a storyline that is a nostalgic grand tour around the biggest dungeons in Tamriel. Considering Blades does not have an open world environment, creating new dungeon environments, all one has to do is have the traveling to X as a text prompt, option, then a loading screen. Skyrim mods have done this before. The upshot to creating new dungeon environments is that they can then be reused as a part of the job pool for players who have finished the quest, breathing new life into the game at that point. The social media and YouTube advertisement leading up to the expansion's release can show pretty new visuals and get people excited about it before it comes out. And provided you do have the manpower in order to create new dungeon tiles, and this is a big ask because who knows, the game might already be on maintenance mode for all I know. If creating new dungeon tiles is within their current manpower that the development team is able to do, then, honestly, it's not really difficult to create a cycle of every 3 months. Here's a new dungeon, here's some new items, here's a new town character, here's one new monster as the boss. At the least, create new quests with existing assets, just with competent writing. One level up from that, you can create new items for players to get. One level up from that, you create entirely new dungeon types. Each new dungeon type can come with cosmetics that are sold in the store. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that cosmetics are most likely not selling nearly as well as I said they could in my previous video. This is due to those cosmetics not being used in a meaningful way. Sure, you have nodes in town to place down those cosmetics that you earn or buy, but when do other players see or even interact with those? I mentioned in the previous video that being able to visit other players' towns, if that functionality were implemented, it would work very well to getting people to buy cosmetics. Unfortunately, and this may just be a limitation about how the game works on a base level, however, what was implied was not outright stated, and that was when visiting the other player's town, the other player would be there. Now, I've realized that would require network synchronization code and also 3D model rigging to show the other player from a third-person perspective. But alas, when I spoke about players visiting other towns and admiring each other's cosmetics, That's the requirement for it to happen organically, is for players to meet up in town. Now, if players could actually meet up in town, then you could get non-armor clothing items and outfits that you could sell to players that they would use just for hanging out in town. They'd have an armored setup, and then they'd just have their clothing for just hanging around town. The game already sells emotes in order to play them to other players in the arena PvP mode. But understanding that in the arena, the interaction level is minimal. There are a couple more vectors for monetization. The biggest and most obvious for the PvP mode would be a battle flag that sits behind your gladiator. If I were designing one, I'd default it to no flag. It would just be a blank leather banner. So you'd have to assign a texture to it based on your progress in the game. An arena champion in ranked mode would get a flag with the season number on it with a crown. But for players who have not ranked in a season yet, they could pick major events that have occurred in the single-player campaign, such as the Bloodfall Queen, the Ayleid Lich King, and make those as their banner. Now, how you monetize, then, is the framework of the banner flag itself, the framework that it rests on. At the workshop, you could buy a wooden one for gold, or craft a rusted iron one, or maybe an ancient Nordic one for high-end players. Then in the gem store, they'd sell silver, gold, platinum, and even an elven crystal pylon. And that would be in a large pack that they could sell for gems, allowing more wealthy players to show off that they are supporting the game. Finally, Zaric and other weird ones could be picked up for sigils by doing events, making it the most expensive sigil reward for players who have already gotten everything they wanted already. Since the banner would be placed in the background of the arena, it wouldn't require active effort on the player's part to show it off. Every time a new expansion hit, players could show off their newest banner that they earned while doing it. As you see, while turning players' towns into a semi-social hub where players can meet up is ideal for selling the maximum amount of cosmetics as quickly as possible, there are other ways too. But we obviously can't go over all of them today. So instead, I'd like to take some time to address towns for a bit. In trying to replicate Cyrodiil in the Elder Scrolls style that Oblivion was, Elder Scrolls Blades developers have created the most boring-looking towns. My suggestion is pretty simple. Create alternate skins for existing homes. By skins, I mean, okay, we have the existing 3D models for the houses, but let's just let people retexture them a bit differently. Theme them. Allow players to buy houses with a different color trim, walls, roofing, things like that with gems. And let players assign them and override the way houses look. For an absolutely minimal amount of effort, you've acquired another customization vector to monetize. And if it turns out well, you can create alternate 3D models for the houses as well. Now, I realize players aren't really going to be visiting each other's towns in order to show off those cosmetics. So we need to fix that. That's where we're going to assume right now that true multiplayer is off the table. True multiplayer will sell cosmetics in droves and is absolutely worth the development time. But if you don't have the manpower and the time to do that, then this is how you do it. First of all, we need to take visiting other players' towns and integrate it into the core gameplay loop. If we want to do this right and more expensively, then what you do is allow people to decide one of 5 or 6 town layouts and actually rearrange the way the buildings are, because let's be honest here, having the exact same town layout in everyone's town is boring. However, if that is too expensive for development, then we can go down a step and just say people will be able to change out what the houses look like and things like that. Either way, Now for the gameplay loop itself. Step 1 would be open up the wall in the northeast corner of town, next to the town hall, kind of diagonally going out. An archway through the wall into a courtyard where the player can build one building. The player will have to choose one guild to put in their town. A fighter's guild, a mage's guild, or a thieves guild. The thieves guild will show up as a tavern once it's built because it's a thieves guild in disguise. Next step, players will be able to join all 3 guilds and get 1 guild job per day by interacting with the building itself. Here's the catch though. They can only build 1 guild, meaning that in order to join other guilds and get those other guild jobs per day, they will have to visit other people's towns. The game will tell them this flat out. And it'll even give them a handy list of other people's towns. The list will be auto-sorted with their friends first, then guild members second, then friends of friends or friends of guild members third, and then finally random people who meet the criteria last, in order to make sure that that list is always filled, but tends to gravitate toward creating a social group. When you log in, you should get a welcome back message, and if other players have visited your town, it would say something like, "Welcome back. When you were away, 10 people visited your town, and 6 took quests at your Fighters Guild. The Fighters Guild has generated 60 gold in taxes for your use." See, we just incentivized the building of it because you earn tax revenue based on whenever a player completes a quest there. Now, players visiting your town should be able to inspect the various cosmetics you picked for the town in an attempt to get the players to buy them. If they are on sale at the time, there should be a link to buy this in store. But this would all be for naught if players don't pay attention, thus reskins of the buildings, allowing people to create a unique looking town atmosphere that other players will have to walk through in order to get to the guild. In general, effort should be put into brainstorming about how each town could be made to look different with a minimal amount of development time. Now, obviously, the best solution is to let people customize what type of building is where and completely rearrange their town layout. However, again, that might be too expensive in terms of development cost. You know what's funny? The guild idea wasn't even the first thing I came up with. The first thing that came to mind almost instantaneously was step 1. Create a new set of resources you find in dungeons. Timber, ore, cloth, and runes. Next step, open the player city's gate and create a plot of land on the main road, across the road from wherever the stables are built. The player will be able to build 1 industry: woodworkers, refinery, weavers, and arcane reliquary. The idea behind this crafting system is that woodworkers can make staves, and then the reliquary could turn them into magic staves that do raw elemental damage, but barely block, if at all. The refinery would allow you to create void stone, which could be combined with void thread from a weaver, night wood from a woodworker, and night runes from the reliquary to create a material that could incrementally increase the effectiveness of your gear once per day. Kind of like my original idea that would work with sigils, but instead integrate it into a new crafting system that would encourage players to visit other people's towns frequently. Players could get some kind of minor bonus for using their own industry building over another town, including the ability to buy a minor amount of farmable dungeon material once per day. This is necessary so that the player feels a drive to build their own building instead of relying on other towns. Kind of like when I mentioned the guild idea, the guild would generate money for the town. Therefore, there was a reason to invest in building it. But yeah, the crafting system idea popped into my head the instant I thought about visiting other towns. But you can see how Fighters, Mages, and Thieves Guild quests are a more straightforward and in-theme way of doing it. Something we've seen in Elder Scrolls 2, 3, and 4. I think that in Blades, in Cyrodiil, it would be the best place to put down guild halls. So it occurs to me editing this video that the Mages Guild was actually destroyed in the early 4th era, and by the time Elder Scrolls Blades rolls around, it is been completely replaced by the Synod. And you know what? I don't have a problem with this. We just, in my idea, replace the Mages Guild with the Synod, or have a local Synod branch, something along those lines. Have them be snooty aristocrats, and that's about it. Just a snooty version of the Mages Guild. No problem. You could even have the College of Whispers and decide whether you want the College of Whispers or the Synod, or get this, maybe a third up-and-coming Mages faction that we haven't quite named yet because they never got big enough. Lots of potential here. I'm just, I needed to tell you guys that Mages Guild is dead and we have to use a different name for it. That's all. And I think there's no reason that the developers couldn't do both. Adding a crafting system like that allows players to create new stuff by visiting other players' towns, and at the same time having quests like that. Although I do really think that the guild is the best of those two ideas. I think it would be best executed with a reputation bar and ranks for each guild. If you wanted to play the long game in this live service, you'd allow players to gain the reputation for 2 ranks right now upon implementation of the faction. And then every expansion, release an additional rank with an associated rank up quest. That's 3 extra quests per expansion, 1 for each guild. You could build anticipation for the next rank that would happen 3 to 4 months down the line as to what the next step of the guild quest would have in store. Even though the functionality, all you did is write some dialogue and dump them in another dungeon with a conversation of a quest NPC they're going to get to know over the next year. A mock-up of the faction screen should have your own player guild at the very top of the list. And then the other factions you're a member of with a reputation bar and a label for the rank you're at. And at the very bottom of the reputation list, you should put Imperial Blades, and the reputation bar should be rusted with your rank being disbanded. Every time you join a faction, it would push the Imperial Blades further down the list, but it would sit there at the bottom as a reminder of where your character came from. So while we're talking about factions, let's open up the northwest corner of the town, next to the town hall. So just like the northeast corner was where the guild hall would be at, the Fighters, Mages, or Thieves Guild, I'd create an archway on the other side of the town hall, which would lead to an empty plot of land that would become accessible after you finished an associated quest. I'd actually make that one of the expansions, and require the player have completed the River Snake questline in order to start it. This quest would place the Bloodfall Queen's territory into contest, and you'd have the opportunity to either solidify the town in the name of the Bloodfall Queen, or pick one of the other counts of Cyrodiil, who would lay claim to the land as its patron. Once the questline was complete, you'd build a palace at that location, and the banners would become one of the 6 colors depending on which patron you picked. Red for the Bloodfall Queen, yellow for Anvil, blue for Coral, gray for Bruma, purple for Cheydinhal, brown for Skingrad. When you got the palace to level 3, you'd be knighted, and you gained the Knight of Faction, in whatever county you became. You'd be a knight of that county. And you'd be able to get a daily quest from them just like the other guilds. You'd be able to buy an arena banner and a crested shield from that particular faction as you gain the first 2 ranks from doing quests. It's very easy because all you have to do is have the exact same banner and the exact same shield, but then change the texture based on whatever faction you decided to join. And it would just be between 6 different factions, aka 6 different textures. I could keep going, but there's plenty of room for expansion on the base city and its mechanics. Plenty of ways to keep players interested. Plenty of ways to get players to visit other players' towns. But what would knock the game out of the park is still real-time hanging out in your town. And of course, the fantasy, the dream of actual dungeon co-op. But really, the game isn't designed for that, and we'd have to completely redo certain systems to allow for multiple players in the same combat session. It would be weird, and it would require some logistics. Honestly, both a technical standpoint and a design standpoint, it would be kind of a nightmare. But it's kind of funny how Elder Scrolls Travel's Shadowkey managed to get co-op multiplayer. Good co-op multiplayer. And that's an old game. Just think about that for a moment. In fact, while you're thinking about that for a moment, look up EKA2L1. That is an emulator that can run N-Gage games. Not ready to really talk about yet. It's in its infant stages, but if you want to contribute, because it looks like it's an open source project, you probably should look it up. That is, again, EKA2L1. I suspect that if it gets the kind of support it needs, you could be seeing people playing Shadowkey in co-op online on live streams. Just something to think about. Okay, with the moment over, let's change gears a bit. No Man's Sky and Sea of Thieves have done 180s to the point where they are considerably better games than how they were released. And it's clear Elder Scrolls Blades is neither one of those games. It's a decent dungeon crawler with a low-quality story and a lot of progression to enjoy. And that's great for a compact mobile format. But I can see why it was not released for the PC and all the other platforms. It's because on a non-mobile platform, it's quite frankly lacking. If you don't buy into the gameplay loop of Blades, you aren't going to see any value in my suggestions here, since they are about making the game more profitable, first and foremost. The fact that they ditched the previous chess system shows they are willing to listen to the community and move in a more consumer-friendly direction regarding gameplay. But the game needs more planning and better management if it's going to be a successful live service and move forward. Remember, Bethesda terminated development on Elder Scrolls Legends, the card game, despite, in my opinion, it being the best electronic card game running right now. I'm not a fan of Hearthstone or Gwent, but it certainly stood head and shoulders above those games with its multiple lanes and prophecy system. So if Bethesda's willing to ditch that, I imagine Blades might be on the chopping block as well, and that's unfortunate because Blades has a lot of potential as a live service, especially if it has cross-progress for its various platforms. Imagine being able to play it for a bit on your computer, then going on a trip, taking it on your phone. That sounds like a lot of fun. But all that potential could just go out the window if Bethesda decides Blades ain't profitable enough. So I thought I'd throw some suggestions out there since I like the Elder Scrolls property and I don't hate Blades. Everything I've said up till now have more or less been off the top of my head. I did write this down just so that I could not repeat myself. However, I could expand upon almost any of the points here, but they aren't paying me to do that. So I'll just leave it with this. By removing the loot chests, they took the first step forward. But with proper marketing and gym spending incentives, the game could be far more profitable than it is now without pissing people off. It's very tempting to make the game more profitable immediately and cost you the long-term audience. However, they have not been doing enough to bring people back. And that's what they need to work on. I've been out of town for 2 weeks on a little work vacation, then I spent about a week back getting all caught up on work stuff. And now I'm going to go out of town for another week because some real-life obligations are no longer waiting for the plague to be over. Still, Blades has been in the back of my head ever since they fixed the loot boxes, and I thought I'd take some time to talk about it before I ran out of town again. Thank y'all for watching. Y'all have a good one now. Got her. No, she blocked. Bam. Done. Endering.